Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of League Project. I'm your host, Rex Bear, and we have Matthew LaCroix with us, the author of Illusion of Us. He's also got a really cool YouTube channel. Just look up Matthew LaCroix on YouTube. I'm going to leave links in the video description box as well. He's been on the show many times. He's definitely a fan favorite. We've talked about the Annunaki in the past and a multitude of other things that are connected to the Annunaki, the red-blue paradigms, yin-yang, etc. And this podcast, this interview, in my opinion, could be the best yet. We just went over a brief rundown on what he's going to be sharing with us, and I'm really excited. Thanks for coming on the show with us here at the League Project, Matthew. You're going to break down 500,000 years of evolution, not just linear. This is great. How the heck are you?
Hey, Rex. Thanks so much for having me on again. I love being here with you.
I'm going to do this in an hour. How crazy is that? Takes a smart person to do that. So, hey, it's good to have you, Matthew. Seriously, I think this is cool.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm going to try the best I can. And like you just mentioned, we're going to try to go through 500,000 years of evolution. And evolution, and that's just a little piece of it, right? But that's the piece that is the most important towards understanding kind of how we got to where we are now. So we're going to have to keep some areas brief, and I apologize to that. But I hope people can go objectively look up anything I say for themselves, because as a good truth seeker, a good researcher, you should be doing that anyway. Never take anyone's word for anything in life. You always got to be the one that you're your own truth seeker, no matter what. We've listened to kind of these experts too long. We need to kind of figure it out for ourselves. So the most important question is, during this kind of unraveling down the rabbit hole, is what is the real story of our evolution? We're taught a very, very linear kind of example of it in school. And there's a curriculum that's taught, and whoever goes through, K through graduating high school, they get a version. They get a version of what they're taught of biology and through evolution and on history. And that version is very tightly controlled. It's controlled by what evidence falls into here, and all those things are in a very linear, very simplistic timeline of kind of this planet Earth kind of in the shadows of the fringes of a galaxy moving through, and there's no one around. It's on its own. It's slowly developing through life, through a lightning strike in some primordial pool of water and through different electrons and neutrons. I mean, this is what we're told, and that's all it ever is. And that slowly apes came along, and here we are. Well, we're going to kind of blow that entire thing out of the water, this journey. Have there been these ancient cedars in the past, in our history? We look up in the night sky, all these stars above our heads, and we've kind of been made to believe in this perception that it's all empty. It's all just empty space. And yet the idea of life coming from even something like a comet or an asteroid is starting to be accepted now. But no one's even talking about the idea of anything else. No one's even talking about the idea that life could have gotten far beyond where we are evolutionary, and then had an effect on all those places around them. So let's look at some of the evidence that kind of talks about that, right? The first place you need to start is at the very beginning. You need to go back as early as you can get. Go back to Iraq and go back to the earliest advanced civilization that we know about. And they're called the Sumerians. And you know about the reasoning behind that based on their language skills and their vocabulary. So you look at the kinds of characters that they had and the amount of characters that they could use for writing, different stories out in their history, and you could tell how advanced they were. And so we know that the Sumerians were very advanced. It seems it's almost where humanity kind of just jump-started out of nowhere, where they all of a sudden had writing and agriculture and all these things. And people kind of jump over that because that's not where the experts are pointing towards. They gloss over that. And they kind of ignore that aspect. And these writings that came from them, these would be the oldest writings we have. And so it would make sense if we wanted to figure out the real story to go back to the earliest writings we can. And what we're showing right here is something called Eridu Genesis, and it's a piece of a cuneiform tablet. And together with many, many other written tablets from all kinds of different civilizations. You get the Enuma Elish and Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. These are all different tablets from different places you can find, and you can read this similar story that completely contradicts the story we're given for our evolution. And that's the idea of what this missing link is. And going down the road of, could we have been tampered genetically? Could our DNA have been tampered with in some sort of a jump start? And so let's continue down this evidence and look to see if men like Darwin have been completely wrong with how our timeline has gone. The first place we'll start is looking at our history and saying there's something wrong with what we're being told. And then when you do that and you start asking those questions, why? I know a lot of philosophers say the most important question you can ask when finding truth is why, because why will always lead you towards wanting to know more. And so in this amazing picture, this is Baalbek, Lebanon, and you see a slab of stone here from thousands of years ago, and people see this and they go, wow, can't believe they did that. But then they never really ask why, and they never even ask how they could have done it. And then we see things like pyramids all over the world, and we just assume that we could build them. We don't ever actually ask the questions if we could build them, and if there's more to the story than we're kind of being told. And of course, most of all of these deep secrets kind of end up back in Egypt, because Egypt represents the great place of secrets of our past. It's where the gods, in terms of our history, spent the most amount of time. And the most amount of advanced technology can be found there, and all these different things. And so when we see these structures and we're told that they were just built to house pharaohs, and they were built in this certain amount of time, and so amount of slaves were killed building them, and all these things, we accept that model because we think to ourselves, well, these were powerful pharaohs, and these slaves below them thought they were gods to them, so they would do anything they could to then build a structure to honor them and bury them. And everybody accepts that. And nobody even looks into the idea that these massive structures you see before you, the Great Pyramids, have never had a pharaoh found in them. The Great Pyramid of Giza has never had a pharaoh found anywhere inside it. And yet that is a single piece of evidence they use in all of our history books to tell us that that's why they're built, right? To honor these great pharaohs, these giant pyramids. And they say, well, why'd they build them like that? Well, they say, well, because the pyramids is the strongest design that wouldn't break down. And that's all they give you. Even Neil deGrasse Tyson says that. I can call him out on that. But so let's go further though. We look at, well, your first thing you see is the Great Pyramid of Giza has some sort of a white cap on top. And a lot of people don't notice that, but that white cap is limestone. And if you look in the records and you look at some of these old photographs, you can see that the pyramids were actually all white. They were all covered in limestone. And over time, both erosion as well as conquering armies would steal all the limestone. And then all you can see now is what's left over on the Great Pyramid. But these pyramids represented completely different purposes than we're being told. So, and let's kind of go down that road to find out maybe some of the reasons why we're not being told the right thing. So you ask yourselves, well, where are all these pharaohs buried? Right next to the Great Pyramids is a place called the Valley of the Kings. And they put a lot of these kings in the same area. And as you can see, there's no pyramids anywhere near it. They just buried them under these mountains in these tombs. So then you guys scratch your head and you start wondering, well, why aren't we being told that? And that's where that long journey of truth begins. Because then you start asking questions about why we're not being told the right thing. And then you start seeing things like this and you realize that there's an entire different reasoning behind history that we're not being given. And you have to, so then you start looking into books and you start to find places like, read books like the Sirius mysteries and all these different things, and you see evidence where they're talking about these alignments with all these various things within the pyramids that our books are completely leaving out. None of them are even talking about. In fact, if you look up what modern history books are telling us, and the Egyptologists are telling us about these long vertical shafts that are found in the Great Pyramid of Giza, they're saying they're simply air vents, right? How much more linear can you get? They're saying they're air vents for whoever was down there so they could breathe. So then you start looking at these air vents a little bit closer, and you see that the Great Pyramid of Giza has these two large rooms called the King and Queen's Chamber. And those chambers have these air vents, as they call them, that are perfectly aligned to these constellations. And these are some constellations that I want us to focus on, because these are the ones that have been shown all over the world and worshipped by all of these ancient cultures as talking about this incredible significance in our past. And so you look at something like the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid of Giza that perfectly aligns in the past, right? In the past to the Orion constellation, the 3 stars of the Orion's belt. And then you look at the Queen's Chamber, which aligns perfectly to Sirius in Canis Major. And then you have Ursa Minor, and you have Thuban and Draco. You have all these different past things in our history that is not simply based on just, you know, when the seasons came through and when all those different aspects of them farming, and that's just a simplistic way to look at it. They would not build massive structures if it simply and align them to all these different places if it didn't mean anything at all. And so we look at these star constellations in the night sky, and specifically in the winter night sky, if you're in the northern hemisphere, Orion and Sirius and the Pleiades, and we wonder if there are these little clues around that are kind of trying to hint at the fact that there's more to it than we know. And one of my favorite ones is one of the most popular cars in the world is called a Subaru. And on the logo, there are these stars, and people are like, yes, this is the name Subaru, whatever. Because nobody actually looks into anything of what it really means, because nobody thinks anything is connected. If they realize things are connected, they'll start looking into things, and they'll kind of blow their mind. Like Subaru actually means Pleiades. That's why there are those stars on the logo. And it goes much further. And these are just kind of silly things, but in a movie called The Truman Show that's very popular. In this movie is this idea that Truman is locked in this fake reality where it's almost like it's a reality show that he's not aware of anything beyond him, and he should just be acting in this kind of very conformed way where nothing ever happens. He can never leave, right? And he's never questioning his reality until this certain event happens in the very beginning of the movie. And he's walking down the street, and all of a sudden this light fixture falls out of the sky and crashes down and lands on the ground right in front of him. You know, of course, think very metaphorically there too. A light falling down from the heavens. So Truman picks up this light, right? An idea of where did that come from? And think about how many metaphors that could represent, both linearly where he is, but also metaphorically too. So he looks on this light, and what does it say on the light? If you pause the movie right at the right time, and of course, with truth, they don't let you have it too long for those who are looking. You have to pause it just right. But it says on that light, it says Sirius, Canis Major. And so Sirius, we're going to talk extensively about coming up soon, is in the constellation Canis Major. So they're giving you a little nugget of truth there about the idea of Truman discovering that. And after that point, I want to get to, he starts questioning everything in his reality, and the whole thing goes down a road where he eventually finds his way out of the Truman Show and realizes that it's all a fake reality that's being given to him falsely. Isn't that kind of interesting? So they use that light to say that for the very reasoning that when we come out of that kind of fake reality of our history and we finally open that door like he does and steps out into the truth of our reality, we'll realize that it's connected to places like Sirius and Orion and the Pleiades, because they're simply just the past of what was an important part of how Earth got to where it is now and how the human species got to where it is. So enough about that. Let's get into some real stuff here. So they keep coming up with this common theme of Sirius and Canis Major. And, you know, why? What is the reason behind that? Well, if you look in our past, there's some nuggets of truth that kind of will blow your mind if for things like Sirius. And my favorite one of all is the Dogon. And this is one that I highly encourage everybody to look into, because on my own personal path of truth, this is what really blew it open for me, that led me on the entire road that I'm on. And the story is this. In the 1930s, 2 French anthropologists visited this remote tribe called the Dogon in Mali, Africa, which is in Western Africa, kind of just a little bit south of the Sahara Desert. And they arrived at these people called the Dogon, had these elaborate cave dwellings and all these drawings, and these Dogon had these strange rituals where they would, every certain amount of years, they would have these rituals where they would act as they were these tall giant beings. They would use sticks to step up so they could reach their height, right? And they would have these strange costumes on and these designs where they would draw in the sand and on artwork on rocks, where they would talk about how they were worshiping this star system called Sirius. And so these two French anthropologists are scratching their heads, because how could this primitive tribe even know anything about that star constellation, let alone have any of this knowledge they did? And so they started looking into what the Dogon actually knew. And when they actually learned what the Dogon knew, it blew their mind, because the Dogon not only understood our solar system, right, our tiny little neighborhood next to us, but they understood this entire star constellation and these specifically these sons of Sirius A and what they knew of as B and C. But here's what the most perplexing thing at the time: Sirius A, which is one of the brightest stars in the night sky, is easily seen, but Sirius B hadn't even been discovered yet with any radio telescopes or anyone. It wasn't even in any books, or no one even knew about it. And because you can't see it with the naked eye, you can only see it with a telescope. And they not only knew about it, they knew the specific orbit of the way it acted around Sirius A, as well as some planets and suns underneath them, as like Sirius C, which hasn't even been discovered yet. Well, so here, this is 1930s. People then could shrug that off and say, big deal. But here we go, in the 1970s, they discover Sirius B, when they finally get telescopes that are powerful enough to see it. All along, the Dogon had known all about these extensive elliptical orbits and all of these things from Sirius. And when these anthropologists asked how they got all of this knowledge, they told them that these beings called the Nomo had given them this knowledge. And so that's where you kind of say, oh, well, who are the Nomo? And you got to start going down that road, right? So then the Dogon described the Nomo as these aquatic fish people. And they said that they had fish suits on, and they described them as being very tall, and they said they came from Sirius. And that's why they knew all about Sirius, because they were describing their home world and their home place. And so the Dogon had all this knowledge, and the anthropologist simply couldn't believe what they were hearing. They wrote it down, they brought it back. And this was written in a lot of stories, and people still talk about this, but it's never taught in any school or anything, because it's considered just myth, right? But it's not really myth if you start to see how it all connects. And so today, if we look at where this fish icon has gone, right? The Jesus fish and all these things, and this fish head, where do we see it today? Well, we see it today with some of the most powerful religions we have in the world, in this hat called the mitre hat, and worn by the Pope, which, if you compare and look to this Nomo fish suit, you see a striking correlation between the two, and really makes you start to scratch your head and wonder how could the head of our religions why would they be kind of almost mimicking these gods if those gods weren't real, if it was all just some kind of created idea, or these cultures had created gods based on the different seasons and based on the different things that they thought brought rain and all these things. Whereas we need to really strongly consider the idea that all these gods shared all throughout the different cultures in the world were all related and connected, and we're all simply the same gods from different places. So Sirius, some interesting things about Sirius. You start to wonder how why all these things from Sirius and all these things. You start to look at some facts about Sirius, and you find out that it's actually one of the largest suns in our galaxy. And because it's accompanied by two smaller ones, and you start to put that together, you say there are 3 suns in relation to this small area. And when you start to see 3 suns in that relationship, remember, we're talking about evolution here, you start to see a correlation directly between, if you have the more suns, you simply have more energy, and life can develop faster. And so now we have to get to looking at our own solar system, right? And it starts to make a lot more sense why things have gone the way they have. So when you trace the ancestral roots of the Dogon, and they talk about where they came from, the story just keeps connecting. It's like the more you look, the more it just keeps going down that road. The Dogons say they originally came from Egypt, and they left Egypt to avoid a religious persecution, and they headed southwest, and they were led by some profound thing, and they ended up in Mali. So they actually were Egyptians. And so you go back to Egypt, where it's just where they originally came from, and you can kind of follow this trail back, right? This evolutionary trail back in our history to try to connect a lot of these lost puzzle pieces together. So let's uncover some of these secrets and try to put this together if we can. And I'm sorry I can't take too long on a lot of these. I love to take all day on some of these, like the Dogon, but we have a lot of things to cover. So arriving back in
fine.
Egypt, yeah, go ahead.
One thing I wanted to throw out there too, real quick, just to interject for a second, is I really like the possibility about these pyramids maybe being some type of energy source at a particular time, like literally being able to be power plants. There was a book written that's available by Christopher Dunn that's called the Giza power plant theory, where they actually at one point were able to harness energy and way above and beyond what we can think of currently without having to use nuclear reactors that have plutonium and uranium and stuff like that are powering them. And then you have to, it's amazing what they go through to keep water cool, isn't it? And sorry to interject, I just wanted to add that.
No, that's a great point, Rex. I appreciate that. You're absolutely right. You're looking at the Great Pyramid of Giza, and we talked about those limestone coverings, right? And so what kind of energy could you harness out of an object like that, with a particular point, with, by the way, our resonance frequency that's tuned inside the Great Pyramids to that of a human being. So if you have a giant energy structure with maybe a crystalline core inside, with a limestone covering pointing towards a certain energy center, let's say Orion or all these various places, like you said, what kind of energy, what could you harness in something like that? And that's how you start getting closer to the truth of what these structures are really for. The interesting thing, one of the most interesting thing is, we talked about these alignments, right? Aligning the king and queen's chamber, aligning to places like Sirius and Orion. But yet today they don't. And so, but that's a very important piece of the puzzle, because if they don't today, then you say, well, when did they? And you can take computers and you can plot in, the different coordinates, and we can figure out when in the night sky these pyramids were aligned correctly. And when you do that, and you start going through the calculations, you start saying, wait a minute, when I plot in 5,000 years ago, which is what they're given in history books for when they were built. Yeah, right. This is the model we're giving of a very linear timeline, that these slowly evolving people eventually decided to have gods that create these giant structures, and then that's it. There's no reason behind them, except the fact that when you plot into the computer, when these pyramids, when the Great Pyramid of Giza, the king and queen's chamber, when were they lined up to Orion and Sirius? Not 5,000 years ago, not 6,000 years ago. Keep going. You just keep going on and up. The numbers just keep going, and you sit there scratching your head. You're like, is this computer right? Am I getting the right calculation? By the time you finally get the correct calculation, you get a number of 10,500 BC, which is roughly 12,500 years ago, which is more than double the age that we're given for when the pyramids were built. It would make sense that when the pyramids were built, they would have aligned them at that time. So now we're starting to get this entirely different age period for our evolution and our timeline. And you keep putting together these lies after lies, and you say, why aren't they telling us the truth about this? Because everything as we know it, with what we could perceive as our history, would completely collapse. With religion and all these different aspects, it would collapse, because the truth is profound. When you go back 12,500 years ago to these advanced cultures that had knowledge that we just simply do not have today, you start to realize that something happened. Something happened in our past that made it so we lost all of this knowledge. That same age you get of 12,500 years ago echoes all across the world. You go into sites like Göbekli Tepe that are more than 11,000 years ago, and you get into this time period that these advanced human civilizations, being guided by gods, had built these megalithic structures and pyramids all over the world. And they were all from the same time periods. And then, of course, we had something happen that wiped them all out, right? And all that knowledge was pretty much lost. And that's what we're kind of trying to dig up and re-examine and figure out today.
You know what that looked like a little bit is I went to this place called Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, and the closest town to that place is Cuba. And when you get in there, it's these Azazi ruins that look very similar to that without the still megaliths that you're looking at, but the circular, the circular brick layerings and stuff like that. They've got a ton of those that were aligned specifically with certain star clusters and the moon. And there's this one area out there where they've got the dagger that forms when the sun hits a certain point of the day. It's really cool.
I'm really glad you brought up that, Rex. I wasn't going to go there because I didn't know if I had time, but that was beautiful what you said there. You nailed it on the head. The same advanced cultures that developed these we see in places like Turkey and Iraq and all across the world, all the way over to Mesoamerica in the United States. You mentioned Chaco Canyon. You're getting into the Pueblo people and the Hopi people. And if you research, go on our channel, we talk all about the Anunnaki influence, all of Mesoamerica, and all these gods were the same gods. All of these structures were all built at the same time, all over the world, at the same time periods, like this golden period, right? A several thousand period window. They were all built. And then, and of course, these cataclysms wiped all these things out. And if you go into the Hopi, and you go into the traditions, what they talk about, they say that in their lore of their stories, of their ancient elders, they say that great beings led them into caves to avoid these cataclysms of these massive waves and floods that wiped everything out on the surface. And the only reason they survived is that they're led into these caves. And then you start going to places like Turkey, right next to Göbekli Tepe, and you start seeing places like Derinkuyu, these giant underground cities that could hold more than 20,000 people with these giant round stones that were rolled over in front of the doorways where people could survive underground. And you start to put it together. You go into the Bible and you see these floods that were talked about all in our history. And you see that these cataclysms wiped out this entire time period on Earth of humanity reaching this advanced state, and it set us back right from the beginning, and we basically had amnesia to the truth. And then some basically jealous gods came in and decided that they could control that by not telling us whatever would happen. That's essentially how we got here with history, to not spoil anything. Okay, so what's some evidence for that, right? That sounds pretty crazy. Well, if you go back and you look at these time periods, we mentioned the Egyptian pyramids 12,500 years ago, and you start looking at when the last ice age was. You look at core samples and timelines of when different events occurred and when periods of time on Earth warmed up. And you say that during that time period of between 12,000 years ago and 11,000 years ago, you have the last ice age ending. The last great ice age we had on the Earth was ending. And what that means is when the ice age was at its maximum, ocean levels on Earth were 400 feet lower than they are today. 400 feet might not sound like much to people, but if you go to a city, the size of some buildings doesn't even get close to 400 feet sometimes. 400 feet is enormous. And that's what the ocean levels used to be lower. So then what happened? Well, most of these advanced civilizations had built along the oceans because that's where the climate was best. You have trade and food from the ocean. And it's basically the logical place to build cities would be near the coast. Well, that's also where they were flooded when these ice ages ceased, right? All that water was melted back into the oceans. And so ocean levels raised back up, and all of these ancient civilizations and structures were then sunken under the ocean. And coming from someone with a geological background, you look at structures like this. This is just off Japan, and you can first of all say that there's no weathering seen these structures are so sharp that you can tell that they were made with some kind of a tool. And look at the size of the divers in comparison next to them. These are enormous structures, and they're littered all across the oceans, especially off of in Asia, down off Cambodia and all these places. Okay, let's get back. We have a lot of stuff still to cover. I want to try to get through all this if we can. So these advanced cultures all over the world we've been given this incorrect story, and we have to try to fit in where Orion and Sirius fits. And it kind of always goes back to Egypt, and it goes back to where this story was given to us first. And the story was given to us from, there's a scientist named Darwin who went to the Galapagos Islands, and he was studying finches and all the different reptiles and species there. And based on his observations with an endemic location, specifically with ants, he determined a model of how evolution was. And he determined it was based on survival of the fittest, complete competition. Whatever species could dominate over the other one would kill the other one off. And that was the entire story. And that human beings simply came from apes who would fight over each other and eventually somehow would learn, various things that would overcome odds to then lose all the hair on their body and all these things. But we're given this idea from Darwin that it's a very simple look at how this evolutionary period occurred. And when Darwin came up with this model, he was actually basing it on ants, because ants have a mentality where the colony is all it cares about is the furthering of the colony, and all they'll do when they come up against another ant nest is simply attack it, right? Fight it and kill off the other ants in an attack. But at the same time, you might scratch your head if you go look at, say, apes in a place where they're in the jungle somewhere. They're not doing that. Apes are not just killing each other mercilessly like ants and fighting all the time. But no one knows that because no one's really looking. They're just taking everything at face value and accepting it. And you look, and what happened is Darwin came up with this concept of evolution, and he even wrote in his papers that he wrote very clearly he expected in the coming years that his theories were going to be disproved because he saw holes in them. He saw huge holes in his theories on how our human evolution went, that he just expected them to be disproved. And this was like a temporary placeholder. Well, it didn't turn out too temporary, did it? Because the church, who at this time had decided they wanted to control history through controlling religion and all these things, you never even consider anything past your planet. The idea of Darwin is simply the idea that everything is too far away and it just takes too long for life to ever reach each other, and so it's always on its own, and that's all ever happens. So let's just start by just ripping that right apart and starting over, and start from scratch to what we can kind of perceive what might have happened, right? Today, if we look at places, a famous scientist named Francis Drake, and we look at something called the Drake equation. Francis Drake basically took and looked at all the different galaxies that we know of, and all of the perceived amount of planets that are there, and even the smaller amount of planets that could actually have life. And then you compound that with the overwhelming odds of all the cataclysms and things that could happen, and you run up against all these different numbers where you try to figure out, well, how many advanced civilizations could there be in the universe, right? It's certainly not empty. I mean, the idea that it's all just little crawling lizards and worms and stuff is so silly to think about. When you perceive the idea that today with Hubble we can count more than 1 billion galaxies. To give that in perspective, our solar system is one of billions of solar systems in our galaxy alone. And there are billions of galaxies with billions of planets that can hold life. So having said that, let's start over and kind of forge the new path for how our evolution.
I want to interject on that.
Go ahead, please.
Because that's what we can see, yet we haven't found the end of the universe yet.
That's right.
So with that said, if the universe is infinite, then there's infinite life throughout the universe. And let's go even a step further on that. If it's continuing to grow and get bigger, although it's infinite, it's going to be a cyclical 8 essentially. And there is no size in a sense. I mean, nothing is really bigger than anything else in infinite space.
Yeah.
There's really nothing to measure it against. And that's just kind of a far out there theory, but I've thought about that before. I mean, how do we know just 100 billion galaxies? Because that's what we can see.
Perceive right now. That's right.
Yeah.
And isn't that amazing what you just said? Yet, we live in this Truman Show reality world where people don't even look up. When in nighttime, when they're just kind of rushing to their next destination, they don't even perceive that there are stars. If you ask someone what a star is, it'd be like, did you know a star is a sun? Most people don't even know that. So we're living in this artificial reality world where we've kind of been taught this very dumbed down version of where we are. So then when people say something like aliens or life, they laugh at you and everyone starts kind of laughing in the room and thinks that's chuckling and funny. But then you listen to something like you just said, we're perceiving billions of galaxies and other planets, and you almost kind of sound moronic when you think you're alone, don't you? It's you sound like a child who like has been in some little dark room somewhere and has never been outside before, because to perceive that we're alone in this universe would be very ignorant. Having said that,
it's also kind of narcissistic.
Yeah. Having said that, let's understand something right now. And I'm going to try to disprove all these things as scientists, because we always have people come back and say, well, scientists say this is why evolution occurred the way it did. And what are you going to say against that? Right now, and I want to try to disprove all of these things. Right now, scientists currently give us this idea that our solar system is 4.6 billion years old, and that, the Earth went through all these different these cataclysm shifts, and that it took so and so amount of time for life to develop here. So if it took this much time for life to develop on Earth, we'll use that as a model for the universe. And we'll say, if it took this much time, then we'll look at other star systems like the Pleiades, and we'll see that they're too young to have the same kind of time. So they'll say like, well, our species reached this much time after millions of years. It would take this much time to reach an advanced state where you could then have the technology to then reach another planet, right? And so they give numbers for that, and they say, well, these star constellations aren't old enough. Except they've completely missed the most important thing: manipulation from somewhere outside of their world, and the idea that not all places have the same cataclysms that occur, and not all places have the same not every planet cools at the same rate. Not every planet has the same amount of magma that erupts from it. I mean, some planets have volcanism for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. We have to consider the fact that all life and all planets develop at their own unique pace and rate, depending on what the size of their sun is, how close it is, how many suns they have. All these different things are extremely important factors we have to put into place to understand how evolution really happens in the universe. And like I said, those past cataclysms on Earth are a major reason why we've forgotten everything, because the Earth has suffered numerous extinctions where literally all life was wiped off it. And so we have to start asking the questions how that life was even able to bounce back that quick. These planets, how we perceive the life as just a random thing, we need to maybe looking at the angle of more like a library of life. Like these planets are like libraries that house all these DNA species, right? If you were to go to a library and say, where can I find this species? Well, it's on Alpha Centaurian, whatever. And you could then you could go to that library of species and find it. That's how we should look at planets. They're their own unique libraries of life. And we happen to be this super evolved species in it that's kind of like within this playground of life that we kind of take for granted and trash and destroy. But to not go off on that too long, let's go back to DNA, because to truly understand some of the evidence behind that we're not being told the truth beyond all the things I've already even said, the biggest place we can find all this evidence is actually within us. It's within our DNA. Of course, nobody besides high-end scientists have the equipment to ever see anything like that. So they're not able to do their own studies on this kind of thing. So the true studies of DNA are being done at the highest level by, the highest ends of, science and government. And what they tell us is basically Now we have this massive amount of junk DNA within our double helix, right? Massive amount of junk DNA. They say, well, we're 90%, 90 something percent the same as a cow or whatever. And the rest of it's just junk. And that idea is so linear and simplistic, isn't it? It's like you think, oh, we're not really anything, are we? And then you go back to working at Burger King or going to, work some 10-hour shift somewhere and come home. And so you'll accept it because that's a very easy way to accept it. Something like that. Where in perspective, if you say, well, what is that junk DNA? And you start giving it a new name, right? Isn't that funny how they gave it that name, junk DNA? It automatically just makes you feel like you ignore it and throw it in the trash. Whereas what it's really called is non-coded DNA because they don't know what it is. That's what it really means. But they give it a label of junk so that nobody in society will look into it. It's a very, very clever way that they've been able to manipulate and control every aspect of what we can perceive in our history and our evolution. So what is this junk DNA, right? They say it's non-coded DNA because it doesn't code to anything else on this planet. That's what that means. So what does that mean? It's exactly what it sounds like. It's not from here. It's as easy as it gets. Our DNA, all that we consider junk DNA, is not from here. And you say, where's it from? Well, it doesn't get, it gets even easier. It's from the gods. It's funny how all these things are kind of sitting there, but until we can actually place them in some kind of an order, they almost don't seem like they fit anywhere. They're too crazy. They're too insane to really be true. And so we never connect them. And so let's try to connect these pieces. And the first place we can connect is looking at the different skull sizes of different the Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, and all these different things that have come before us. Looking at Neanderthals and Denisovians. And you start to say, well, where is this missing link? Where are these things that show that we're not the same as apes? The first thing is looking at cranium size of a Homo sapien in comparison to some of our past ancestors. And looking at it, someone who isn't an anthropologist would not even know that those are even related skulls. Human beings, the Homo sapien skull is so much larger than our past ancestors that the jump that occurred in the brain size would have been impossible, completely impossible with evolutionary terms that they're giving us. They think that all of this occurred in a course, in terms of brain jump in a few thousand years. It just, we're being told this macro versus micro version of evolution that's completely wrong. And so Lloyd Pye, this great researcher and scientist, he was looking into all these anomalies with the human structure and how they don't fit in linearly to the niches on the planet and the things that we see around us, and how like these Homo sapiens, we're told we're just apes. We don't fit into anything else on the planet. If you took a human being and you just picked them up and you brought them somewhere in the wilds and you took all their clothes off, right, and you just let them go, that person would die. Because they have nothing to survive. Not only do they not have any instincts any longer, but they don't have, which is not the most important thing, but they don't have anything evolutionary on their body to help them survive. They don't have any hair. They don't. They're poor runners. Their skeletal structure is extremely poorly designed. If you look at it, it's actually it didn't go in a form where, example, the Neanderthal and the Denisovian were much better runners and much stronger than we are, right? And so there's these strange things that you look at with our skeletal structure and our brain size that don't fit into our timeline. And you look at the things like our pelvic bones and all the different things that seem to have this resonance frequency to them. We seem to have this specific design within everything, within our bone structure and our DNA, that is the opposite of what we're told. It's actually part of a plan. It's part of a specific manipulation for a reason. It's part of a jumpstart to jumpstart us ahead of time so that we can maybe reach a certain state. Because like I said, the earth has suffered cataclysm after cataclysm where life was wiped out. And guess what was happening during that time when life was wiped out? Life was advancing at an alarming rate elsewhere while we were having to start over again. And so it's not hard to see how we've been so simplistic and slow in our evolution if you consider the age and all the things that have happened in our past. Let's try to understand the cosmos better and kind of these things that happened before us. And I call it our cosmic neighborhood. It's time for us to kind of step out and understand our cosmic neighborhood a little bit, and to look up and to know what we're looking at with all these constellations and these places around us, and how they've maybe had an influence on our past. And so the first thing to consider is the idea that what if there was a plan put in place for certain planets? If you're an advanced species and you're able to kind of look down at these places and you have technology that's far beyond anything you can understand, and you could actually see what, the temperature of the internal of the planet was, and how long it would take it to cool enough where life could develop on the surface, and then when weather systems would be favorable enough where the temperatures could reach a certain state. All those things could be calculated, and all those things could be very carefully looked at so that you could actually plan life out. You could actually say, I wanted life to reach a certain stage when it reaches a place in the galaxy where its frequency and consciousness can be at the highest place. And that's the idea of what I want to put out there for us, is that our simplistic timeline that we think is so random and based on our own actions is actually is much more of a specific plan, kind of with the hopes that humanity would maybe grow up and kind of take the reins of its own story someday. And one day we could meet maybe these beings when we're old enough, when we're not, dropping giant bombs on countries and causing mass casualties, and when we're all just the same planet, and we realize that war is a completely silly, barbaric, childish thing. Once we rise above that and actually kind of join this cosmic neighborhood, and we'll realize that that's the entire reason why they're not evident to us. There's not flying saucers all the place and all these things, because we would freak out if we saw that. Like in the movie, in one of the later Star Wars, where they go to, they have to interject with a volcano that's going to go off to destroy this culture that's there, and they accidentally get seen by the culture. That's very much like the idea of how it occurs, where you could tamper with a species, but if you did too much in a certain time, you could freak them out and alter the entire way that their timeline goes, because you've introduced all of these foreign things to them.
I've got a curveball for you.
Go ahead
on that
please.
One, because I've thought of the possibility also. There's a lot of people, especially the Gnostics, of yesteryear, maybe not many now, but many of the Gnostics from 1,000 years ago, a couple thousand years ago, felt that the manipulation of man was actually for our imprisonment more so than for our enlightenment. And I know that a lot of people think that, Enki and Enlil, either one of them's good, the other one's bad. And I don't know if necessarily either one of them, I'm not going to classify them as good or bad based upon if they came to this earth and if they manipulated man. I think they did it for their own benefit, though, not for ours. It'd be kind of like us, or not us, because I don't want to do any experimentation on animals, but it's like some geneticists out there that do experimentations on specific animals and testing and stuff like that. And a lot of times they'll do it to cure something, but then you've got the defense applications that do it for the opposite of that. Okay, let's put this virus into this rat and see how quick it'll die. Let's give this rat all this GMO and see how quick it'll get tumors all over its body. Stuff like that. So have you ever wondered if the manipulation of man, and there's people that talk about this as well, that say that are like Cremo Mutwa, I think I pronounced his name right this time. I hope I did, because I really want to get that gentleman's name right. Somebody made a comment that I said his name wrong last time, and I felt bad about it. This gentleman talks about how literally the sky people came down and manipulated us. From one point, we were one being. We were androgynous, yes. We were hermaphrodites, and we could actually just think something, and we could think to an animal, come here, we're hungry. It would literally come down. We would, kill it, eat it, but not to the point of, you see a lot of people now where they're so obese because food is just so readily available. It was consuming not more than you would give back, in essence, at that point.
Those are great points. I agree with them very much. See, one of the problems with going through 500,000 years is you can't stop on one area too long. And so one of the things that I didn't really have a chance to really talk about yet is that what if, those who think they're in control of somewhere, right, are simply puppets for someone else. So we look at the planet Earth and all of these things that have happened in our past, all of these terrible things we can perceive as being just utterly horrible. And
maybe it's because of them that we are at war so much. I'm sorry to interrupt again, but maybe it's because of
that's a good point too.
That they injected into our DNA that makes us that way in essence.
Well, it's not even just that. It's that they steered society towards war. So it's kind of like if you take an animal and you beat like a dog in a dog fight, and you beat it all the time and you hurt it all the time, that's all it's ever going to know to act, right? That dog is going to think that its whole life it should just be in fight or flight mode. Right. When in reality, if that dog was then taken and brought outside and taken for a walk up to a lake and swam and pet and then given food and love, that entire dog, he was never supposed to be in that anger state. He was supposed to be in a happy state, but he was driven to that state and kept there. That's the very point I want to make. What we need to understand and perceive is that not all beings in the universe and not all beings around us wanted our conscious enlightenment. I've done other shows with you where I've delved into some of these darker forces that did not want humanity to reach a higher conscious state. The picture I have on here is a great example, the idea of this clash between red and blue, and these frequency clashes between how they want kind of both our mental, physical, and chakra state to run. Do we want to be like human beings who are emotionally connected to our highest spiritual self, or a being who's trapped in his red root chakra in a fight or flight mode, like that dog stuck in endless dog fights that never can get out of that pen? We're like that human species. Now, during these exponential wartime and suffering, it has actually caused a side effect that most don't think about, and it's caused us to expedite our evolution to a very fast rate. And looking at the course of what kind of adventures have occurred in the last 100 years and how far we've come just in the last several hundred years, it would blow your mind. And that's all been during a time of war. And absolutely, war is not a means for good by anything. But there is something to say for if you look at a human being and you tell them a bunch of truth and you say, "What are you going to do with that truth?" And they say nothing sometimes, and they go and they sit down in the sun somewhere. And you scratch your head and you understand why they don't want to do something to help everybody, because not everybody has drive. Not everybody wants to push themselves and to be something else and to go to the next stage of themselves. So the only way to do that is to stress it. You would have to stress the species. That's the only way you would be able to force it to push itself. Because if you kept it in too peaceful of a state, in ignorance, and you didn't give it any knowledge, it would never go anywhere. It would just stay there. So on the surface, while it seems apocalyptic, all the things that have occurred in our past, everything that I've come to see is actually that those who we perceive of doing evil may have actually just been part of some higher plan that they're not even aware of. And that's kind of been the way it's gone in a lot of ways, right? To not realize that we're not just simply alone in that we're fighting for ourselves here with these angry elite families and we're all alone at their mercy. I think we should strip that away and not hold that any longer. From the temples and structures alignments we see from Teotihuacan and Chichen Itza in Mexico, all the way across the ocean to the Great Pyramids of Giza, we see that these advanced civilizations, they were worshiping Orion and Sirius and the Pleiades. And it gets deeper than that too. It's not simply because those beings could have come here. It's not. It goes even further than that. It actually may be to a level of where souls even incarnate in various things like that. If you look into what Orion represents, you can see that Orion represented the masculine energy, and it was a place of resurrection, whereas Sirius was the fertility, life, and the feminine side. It was about a balance of the cosmos. It was like a circular balance they were trying to also show. So there's a lot of reasons why a culture would want to worship with something, and it wouldn't just be one thing. It actually, in some cases, is several things. And I want to point something out really important that a lot of people have brought up. This is a point that is critical. In all this stuff, talking about Planet X and Nibiru and all our history of the Annunaki and cuneiform tablets, they say, well, they supposedly came from this Planet X Nibiru, yet all of these pyramids and structures all over Earth, nothing, and all of these gods, they don't actually worship Nibiru, and they don't really talk about it at all. And the idea is simply that Nibiru, Planet X, and Earth, this is just some outpost in a solar system, and it's part of something much greater. Orion and Sirius are part of something much greater, much larger, and we're kind of like this, these new kids out in the fridges somewhere that are kind of developing and going through teenage puberty and stuff. That's the way you can kind of perceive us, and that's how the idea that the kingship was lowered from heaven, because it was simply lowered from these royal families, right? These bloodline families, which is, you can see that obsession all through these Illuminati things and all these things. It's because they're trying to protect the ancient bloodlines from all the way back to the pharaohs. And I want to point out some interesting things about these gods of the past, like Enki, who is represented Poseidon, and like Zeus, represented as Enlil. We need to look past the fact that these are Greek metaphors and that they're related directly to these gods of our history. And that's who these beings were. So just to go into this really quickly, you look into numerous cylinder seals on how Enki or Poseidon was represented, and you see he was that aquatic being. We showed him as the Nomo, who spoke to the Dogon before. So he's this aquatic being who said he was from Sirius. It starts to make total sense looking at the cosmos. This collaboration of these families, Sirius and Orion, who then had to come beyond Planet X. That's why, if you look at people like Enlil who hate Earth and hate being here, some of them are forced to be here, or were forced to be here in the past. So there's a lot of history that we simply just don't even understand, of these gods that came before us, and these royal bloodlines that then trailed down to the kings and pharaohs of history. And we perceive them as just being these men that ruled over slaves, but it was much more than that. It was about these bloodlines that have come from the stars, and this genetic jumpstart evolution that had occurred within our DNA at a certain time, that had brought us to the point where we are now. And you can see that occurred around 250,000 years ago or so. And that's how you can find these missing links to understanding this all throughout history. So what we have to understand, getting towards the end of this, right, where we are right now, as we're traveling towards the center of our galaxy, we're supposed to, all the records, if you can look, we're supposed to fully be in the age of Aquarius in around 2025 or 2027. Over the next 8 to 10 years, I think we're going to see everything change. Everything is going to change in regards to this information and the truth, and you can already see it bubbling at the surface, because the truth has been suppressed so long and so many lies have been compounded that's why it's had to be held back, because it's almost like it's become so big that if it came out, it would collapse so many things at once, that they have to give these little pieces, right, in movies and music and all these things, to kind of ease us in science fiction, to ease us into when the truth fully actually does get finally disclosed in the future. And as we kind of run into this time when this kind of, we'll call it the old energy, is kind of fighting to hold on to the old paradigm and is trying to derive war here, we have to free ourselves from all of these created and fake things and all of these manipulations of fear that hold us and bind us in our red root chakra. And once we move past those and all of this tyranny, we'll no longer be held back from it. It'll be like moving a complete different step in the next step of our timeline of our evolution. And we'll finally be out of that illusion of us that they've kind of kept us in. Do you agree with that, Rex? What do you think?
I'll tell you, the illusion of us is such a cool title for your book, because it really puts into perspective the paradigms that we live in, the duality. And I would like to see things change for the better, obviously. I would certainly appreciate seeing these new technologies come out into the market, and, new medical breakthroughs and discoveries and stuff that's probably been around for 50 years or longer that has been, invented, that has been suppressed. I would like to see that kind of tech come out. I would like to see the amateurs, those that are working out of their garage trying to do something great, like myself and others.
It'll happen, man.
You do this. Obviously, you don't make any money doing these podcasts. You're doing this out of your busy schedule, taking time out of your day, and this is important. You even giving your book away for free. I remember before, you're like, yeah, if you want to copy my book, just send me an email and stuff like that. And I'm thinking to myself that book costs you money.
I gave a couple thousand copies away because I believe the truth is so powerful that once you really acquire it, it's no longer your responsibility to hold it in. It's your responsibility to try to, not preach, but try to teach.
Awesome. And what else would you like to share with us before we close out tonight? And please give our audience your website, your YouTube channel, and any data to get in contact with you.
Thanks, Rex. I create a lot of movies. It's one of my passions to create short movies and try to find whatever I can to use. Not being someone that's in a movie producing studio, but I try to create some really cool content on my YouTube channel using music and to try to tackle a lot of different areas, not just ancient history, but on just anything about consciousness and about us thinking outside the box. So I encourage everybody to check out my channel and subscribe. And I'm currently writing the next book called The Stage of Time, which actually talks about timelines and how they could be manipulated from beyond the stars.